So first of all, thank you all very much for coming today. I recognize that this is a very, very busy week in Singapore, and I know you had lots of alternatives in terms of where you can spend your afternoon. So we really do appreciate that you're here. Looking at you turning out in numbers, I know you didn't come for me. I think you came for my panel. So let me kick things off by introducing my panel, first and foremost. So David Greely is the chief economist at Abaxx Technologies and is the host of the Smarter Markets podcast. And I think the best way for me to introduce David is by the fact that I first met him when he invited me and interviewed me for one of these podcasts. And since then, he's done a series of podcasts, 4 different series, I think, David?
That's about right.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of promotion for David. What are smarter markets? I think we all want to know that. Demystifying the carbon markets, that's one I landed up being called upon for. When markets break, and winter is coming, being the most current one, and still continuing. And I don't know how many people he's interviewed, but the thought process behind getting him on stage here today is that I can't possibly go and interview those 20 people or get them up to be on my panel, but here's the accumulation of all of their knowledge. So I think I'm calling on David to tap into some of that knowledge today. In 2016, when I arrived in Singapore for the first time and I brought my carbon credentials around the market, most people didn't understand what I was doing. Most people just didn't know who I was. Herry was the only exception. And the number of occasions where Herry was at the time I might get your designation wrong, you were Asia Pacific head for sustainability at ING Bank, right?
Sustainable finance.
Sustainable finance, right. So I would sit down with Herry and I would listen to her talk and she would hear me talk. And she'd come from a sustainable finance background. I'm from a carbon background. And at some point we realized we understand each other, but we don't speak the same lingo. You know, we have different jargon, we have different focus. And we never landed up working together on anything because, frankly, we were coming from different worlds. But I think more recently our worlds are beginning to clash and overlap, and that's part of the reason why I knew Herry was going to be a really good panelist for this session. Anthony, how long have we known each other? 15, almost 20 years?
Scary, but
yeah.
Yes.
And I'm going to embarrass Anthony a little bit because Anthony is now the Executive Fellow. He's got lots of titles. Executive Fellow, Strategic Engagement, Center for Nature and Climate at the World Economic Forum, and is also a senior advisor to the CEO and chair of the advisory board of Mission Possible. But I think for me, besides being a fellow lawyer who went and did better and more wonderful things than I did, I always think of the impact that he's made in the climate policy and the carbon space since stopping being a working hardcore lawyer like myself. And all of you, if I say the word stranded assets, will immediately know what I mean, right? He's the guy who essentially is responsible for you knowing that, for the time that he was the CEO at the Carbon Tracker, and Carbon Tracker defined and identified what real carbon stranded assets were. So I'm very, very glad to welcome you back to Singapore, and probably for the first time, us talking at the same purpose at the same time with the same goal, right?
We're always doing deals together for the same end, get that deal done, but yes.
Yes, right. So with that little bit of introduction, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, the toilets are at the back, but they're very difficult to find. There's a button. You press that button, but you've got to know which button to press. Anyway, they're at the back if you need it. We will have a social drinks after the event. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, but we would like to try and keep some time for Q&A at the end. Of course, if you've got a question that we can't get to during the course of the session, hopefully our panelists will be around and you can ask us individually. But we really do hope that you do keep those questions for us. But we do have a lot of ground to cover, so keep it to the end. Okay, I think that's most of the housekeeping. So David, you've been at the discussion end of some of the most important topics of present time. You've done topical subjects, which were carbon markets, because they were new in their new guise of version 2.0. But you've also looked at energy markets, and you've looked at energy supply and security issues. Some of it is supply and demand, some of it is geopolitical, and I think you've got a pretty good feel for things in the way the world is operating from a carbon and energy policy perspective. But when I think about some of the various podcasts of yours that I've heard, there are two of them that really stood out to me. And I think they stood out to me because I was looking at it from the perspective of answering and thinking about some of the hard issues for myself and looking for answers for things I couldn't explain. Until I came across your podcast with Robert Friedland of Ivanhoe Mines and Daniel Yergin, who's the co-chair of S&P Global. And both of them talked about this thing called Plan A, right? And Plan A was essentially the idea that we need to decarbonize because we have a climate change problem. In order to address the climate change issue, the solution is build renewable, electrify your transportation process, and roll all of that out, and in the process, reduce dependency on fossil fuels. But both of them expressed a significant concern that Plan A may not work. And David, tell us a little bit about your impression of their take on Plan A, and do you agree or disagree with any of that?
Right. So one of the fascinating things about being able to, do the podcast and have the conversations with these folks is you start to hear the things that one side's saying and another side is saying something different. And you're like, why aren't these things lining up? And I think you picked two great podcasts because when you listen to the climate conversation broadly, I think you hear, okay, we need to have a roadmap. We need to get to 2050. We need to get to net zero. If you look at where the carbon emissions are coming from, it's primarily fossil fuels. And even within fossil fuels, it's still the majority is coal burning. So second to that is oil use. So if you're going to have any chance at getting to net zero, you need to get the coal out of power generation, and you need to expand power generation to take oil out of transportation. And so that's kind of what I think of as Plan A, this idea that we're going to electrify everything, and then we're going to power that grid, power that energy system with low-carbon renewable solutions like solar, like wind. And there's a few things. I grew up in the energy markets, so I come from more of a commodity background. And when you live in the commodity world, you think in terms of physical stuff. You think of barrels of oil, you think of tons of metal. And when you read these reports and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it, you start to immediately ask yourself, well, how much stuff do we need? Do we have the supply to meet the demand? And Robert was great because Robert looks at it and, has developed some of the biggest mines in the world. And he had a great story that caught my attention before I had him on the podcast back at the FT Lausanne conference earlier in the year. And he talks about the Kamoa-Kakula copper mine complex that he just brought online. He started working on it 28 years ago. It came online last year. So it's going to be the third, maybe second largest copper mine complex in the world, powered by hydro, very clean, very friendly development. And you say, oh, that's fantastic. And then you bring out, okay, how much copper do we need for the energy transition? Okay, we need to double the amount of copper we're currently producing. So that means we need one of these complexes that he's just opened. We need to be opening 2 to 3 of those every year. And you say, well, Robert, were you working on 2 or 3 others every year for the past 28 years? And obviously the answer is no. So you look at these plans and you say, supply and demand aren't anywhere near matching up. And when I had Robert on the podcast, I asked him about, you seem like a little bit of a voice crying out in the wilderness when you first were speaking that. And so I think Daniel Yergin coming out, there's no one who's more, center of the energy markets than Daniel Yergin. And S&P Global did a study, and they said, look, we need tons of different types of materials to make the energy transition work. Let's pick one. So everybody understands copper. You're going to need copper for the electrification, you need it for wiring, everything else. And when you look at the materials needed, if you go to electric vehicles, like a Prius would take 2.5 times the amount of copper that a normal car takes. As you get into heavier vehicles, maybe 10 times the amount of copper. If you want to build a onshore wind facility, that's like 9 times the copper of a natural gas turbine for generating electricity. So massive amounts of copper. And they just went through their scenarios and said, can we do it? And what they found was that it looks like, best case, you are doubling the amount of copper that we need. And to put that in perspective, if you look at the copper that we'll need just for the energy transition, so not growing the rest of the world, but just for the energy transition through 2050, it's equivalent to all the copper we've mined since 1900. Now, Edison only started putting up streetlights in Manhattan in 1880. So think about all the wiring across the entire world, and we're supposed to come up with that over the next 30 years, plus some, because we like to use copper for other things too, like plumbing. And so I think when you find someone like Daniel Yergin coming out and saying we have a problem here, then it starts to enter the mainstream. And so for me, I think the point now is we have this conventional wisdom, what I call Plan A. How are we going to get to net zero? And I believe it's important, existentially, that we get to net zero. But if it's not going to work, what's Plan B? So I think we need to refocus that conversation of, hey, this path that we're all in agreement that we're going to do, we're going to electrify everything and we're going to drive Teslas and it's going to be awesome. If it's not going to work, what's the backup plan? And I don't think we have a backup plan right now.
I'm going to echo a few more numbers because you've articulated some of them very, very well, but you were a bit copper focused, so I'm going to diversify into some other commodities. And this is not original stuff. This is me cribbing off other people's work. So it takes roughly, on average, 16 years to get a resource from the point of discovery to the point of production. All right? And by the way, 2030 is 8 years away. If you want to fully replace hydrocarbons using solar and battery technologies, it requires a quantity of minerals that exceed the known global reserves today for those minerals. So either we need new minerals and new technology, or we need to continue to really look harder. The International Energy Agency estimates that for a path that is much shorter than our process of eliminating hydrocarbons, we need to increase the amount of minerals such as lithium, graphite, nickel, and rare earths by significant percentages. Lithium, 4,200%. Graphite, 2,500%. Nickel, 1,900%. Not doubling. We're talking thousands of percent increases. And ING, in one of their studies, found that if you want to meet these International Energy Agency transition goals, we would require about half of all current aluminium and copper production and about 80% of global nickel output to be diverted towards these goals alone, right? So it's a very hard task to find the necessary metals and minerals if we truly want to decarbonize. And it made me realize, I think, and maybe David, you can tell me your thoughts on this, that the climate journey is a decarbonization journey, which is a metals journey, but we don't seem to be weaving that thread in terms of our climate policy and our energy policy. Is that something you would agree with, disagree with? What's your sense?
I think right now, I think to me, what's happening in Europe, even going back before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is a great example of what will likely go wrong in the future if we don't make policies connect the way you say, if we don't connect climate policy to energy policy to metal and minerals policy. Because the scope of materials we need is vast, and we've never done anything near what we're contemplating doing. The IEA's path to 2050, they worked out a scenario to net zero, and that path requires that we use 95% less coal, about 75% less oil, and about 55% less natural gas. That's not slower growth, that's less. So now, if you look back over history, we've never used less of anything except maybe whale oil. Even today, more carbon emissions come from burning coal than anything else. And I would imagine most of us sitting around rooms probably thought coal got phased out a long time ago for the most part. And, in Europe, in the US, that had been true. So I think that the scale of what we're contemplating of transforming over an energy system that we've been building for over 100 years, and in 30 years, replacing it completely, there's nothing that's ever been comparable to that in human history. And if you don't get it right, you have the situation that Europe's running into, that you don't have enough reliable energy, you don't have enough secure energy, and then what happens? We all know no one's going to freeze to death, no one's going to want to starve. So when push comes to shove, you fire up the coal plants and you do what you got to do. So we need to be thinking ahead and navigating this well, or else it's going to be a disaster. I mean, Europe's burning more coal now than it was years ago. So where has that policy taken us? And when you think about, going forward, what we're going to see, because all these new technologies, even producing, the wind farms, producing the solar, it requires so much metal and mineral that energy security is going to become mineral security. And so if you think about not only the quantity that we need, but where do they come from? I'll give you an example. Just sorry to be copper-centric. I'll throw one other one in there. But, 2 countries produce 40% of the world's copper. So Peru and Chile, 40%. OPEC 10 produces, or OPEC plus, so that's 23 countries, including Russia, produce about 40% of the oil. So we think OPEC is interesting to deal with. That's 23 countries. Going to replace it with 2. And then if you think of things like cobalt for lithium batteries, think about over 60% comes from one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you are massively changing where the metal comes from. That's going to create where your energy comes from, completely redrawing the map of what geopolitics will look like. And by the way, all that supply runs more or less through China. So you're going to be very reliant on China as well. So I think there's just so many pieces of this supply chain, and that's a word a lot of folks learned over the past year. You need people who have been in the metals business like Robert Friedland. You need people who are used to working in the energy business, who are used to counting the tons, to help guide you through to see what's feasible, or else I think we're just going to run into that brick wall.
Which is probably why the International Energy Agency said that an energy transition is a shift from a fuel-intensive to a material-intensive energy system. So back to your point about supply chains. Herry, you're now head of sustainability and sustainable finance at SGX. You wear a broader remit than you wore when we first met in 2016. The world hasn't gotten any easier. If anything, it's gotten a bit more complex. But you've always understood ESG the way it was, I think, meant to be understood. But those of us who are struggling with the different perspectives of how ESG is used sometimes struggle to understand, is ESG adding, helping with this challenge, or is it hindering? And there is 2 sides to this probably, right? There's one side that says ESG is being used as a tool to encourage disclosure. And disclosure is good because that's transparency, that allows people to truly understand what they're investing in, and why is that in any way at all a bad thing. Then there's another side of it where we see people using ESG as a tool to define what they mean as something being sustainable. So the EU taxonomy being an example where in order to work out what is green, one of the things that conclusions they reached is that nuclear and LNG should be considered green, which doesn't sound very ESG, if I may say that, in a very simplistic way. And they've got into trouble. NGOs are threatening to sue them. we have pushback on some ESG themes coming out of America in particular. Stuart Kirk's talking about hyperbole, really, between central bankers about ESG issues. So what's going on? Where is ESG today? Because for 2 years, we were told it's going to save all of us and we have to bed it in and we have to swear by it. But we're seeing pushback. Why are we seeing that?
Before I go on to that, can I just add to David's comment? So, of course, there's the primary supply of minerals and critical metals, etc., that is absolutely essential for the energy transition and net zero transition that we have to see. But then that's also where the secondary market, i.e. recycling, circular economy, these topics have been around for quite a number of years, including by ING when I was there, because the Dutchies have been leading on this topic. But the reason why it's still quite obscure, although it clearly is another important environmental objective, aside from climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, etc., it's precisely because of this point. We have to find alternatives, and the only way we can do that is actually making the economy more circular. Having said that, when you actually look at the cost of implementing those, that is what is preventing the scaling up of these things. So, what we're seeing is sector by sector, there are technological and cost curves for, marginal abatement cost curves, and at some point when the prices of the world as we know today, as we produce, becomes too high, that's when some of these solutions actually become solutions that are implementable. So just wanted to put that out there for further discussion later. So ESG, so you helped to define a little bit what ESG is, although I don't even know what ESG means, actually. So let me try to break this down, because ESG means very different things to different people from my observations. First of all, when we talk about metrics and data around E, environment, social, and governance, do not villainize the access to data. These are fundamental for everyone to understand, are we on the right track? Right? That's why even for UNFCCC process, there was just launching of just a starting open consultation of data, open access data for carbon-related information, Macron, Bloomberg, and some of the other key data providers are in there. But so why is ESG data important? So recently we just launched a data platform, disclosure platform called SGX's ESG Genome, quite clever name. And that's a partnership with MAS. And the reason why we did that were two fundamental faults. Number one, there were 27 indicators that were distilled from the key disclosure standards, GRI, SASB, TCFD, and some of World Economic Forum's core and extended metrics, actually, to really understand what are the material indicators that the world actually needs to see, not only investors, which it was primarily for, but for other stakeholders as well. Mind you, these metrics are mostly impact-driven or performance-driven, i.e. they are looking at quantitative metrics on E, obviously the CO2 emissions themselves, megawatt hours of energy utilized, water consumption, etc., quantitative on the social, and mostly quantitative on the governance side as well. These kinds of fundamental data is important. So let's not villainize the data. That's component number one. And most of these have what's called materiality, right? That's been assessed, but every company should look at what is material to themselves, do that assessment, because that then leads on to next topic. So another way to define ESG is from the risk lens, okay? And for all companies, whether financial, non-financial, one must do environmental social risk assessment. And that assessment is being enshrined in law today across the world, including here, including in Europe and elsewhere too. Now, so for corporates, that's quite clear. Once you start to enter into the financing world, that's where the definition of ESG gets quite murky. Ever since decades ago, investors actually have been driving the theme of sustainable investing, responsible investing through 6 main strategies. And one of them is called ESG integration. And typically, ESG integration is what is actually pertaining to the risk lens, i.e., are there risks that's going to impact my returns? And ESR policies, we were talking about M&A, contingent liabilities in M&A deals. These are all risk-focused lens. That is one of the 6, though. So once you start to talk to investors who are very used to that world, ESG, straight away, they think of ESG integration. What are the other 5? There's also norms-based investing, which is, and by the way, these are not mutually exclusive. They're typically used in combination. There's norms-based investing, which is typically looking at societal norms. There is positive screening, i.e. looking at companies that are doing well within the sector. And typically those are ESG indicators. There is also, did I mention negative exclusionary screening? No. So excluding companies who are not doing well, right? And that can have several lenses, including ESG or too much emissions, all sorts of ways. And then there's positive thematic, right? So what we typically call like green, right? Or contributing towards climate change mitigation. These are thematic investment strategies. And the final one, positive impact, so impact-driven methodologies. That's another strategy. So ESG, once you start to get into the investment world and you just start using ESG overall, people will be confused. So those strategies have in place. Now, how is this translating into the regulatory world today? To give a couple examples in different jurisdictions. If you look at the EU, and I don't like to only use developed markets, but I'm going to use it because that's where the definitions and regulations that's actually enshrined in law already are most clear, and therefore it's becoming reference rather than something to necessarily copy because it's been created to befit the market. But there is a distinction in sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is mandatory for all financing institutions, whether that there be investors, asset owners, pension funds, investment managers, insurance companies, etc. And number 1, all funds have to be able to state, are you integrating ESG risk? And the definition of ESG risk can be quite wide and is a little bit more open for interpretation. But regardless of whether you're labeled ESG, you still have to do this. And if you do have risk that's ESG related, then how are you mitigating it? Now, another layer is what's called SFDR. There's even more jargons that's coming out in the world, SFDR Article 8. And that is, are you supporting some of the ESG themes, right? So are you actually creating a fund that's going to exclude some companies, or that's going to quite explicitly going to do ESG integration in a manner where you're going to explicitly say that is one of the key marketing and selling aspects of this fund. And then what's called Article 9 is when you're actually creating impact and contributing towards an aspect of ESG. So what we have been seeing as part of strategies that's been running for quite some time is now becoming enshrined in law. Here in Singapore, we are seeing prevention of greenwashing, so ESR policies. I'm sure there's some financiers in the room. You guys have to be working on that, right? What is your ESR policy specific also to the market that you're operating in out of Singapore as well? So sorry to the ones who are international companies who don't have headquarters there, where it's already being done elsewhere, but you have to repeat it here in some ways. And if you're labeled ESG in some way fund, then you also have to articulate why is that the case. So in the financing world, there's a lot of different ways that one can actually break down what ESG means. Now, just a final point. Talking about mining companies, where we have seen, and personally, I believe there needs to be further distinction. The definition of ESG in the mining world is, yes, there has been some high-profile incidences that led to mining as a sector overall. So different sectors have different levels of ESG risk typically that has been categorized. Unfortunately, mining, whether it's ESG rating or credit rating, is categorized as a high risk. Now, so things like, like dams bursting or artisanal mining, but these are a little more isolated incidents. They don't apply to every single miner. So in some ways, it is a bit unfortunate. So having said that, there does need to be very good ESG risk policies in place because every company should, full stop. Right? So mining companies who do have good policies in place, and if an investor decides to invest in companies from positive screening for companies who have good ESG policies and risk mitigation, then they will get selected, right? But so that's the ESG risk layer, which all companies should do. And that should be done by companies, and that's also being done by investors. Second layer is then looking at thematic contribution by mining companies. There are certain critical metals in energy transition today and net zero transition in general. We will need them, right? So whatever those critical minerals or metals are, right? Do not confuse the fact that they are part of technological solution value chain for climate or green solutions, right? Versus ESG risk, right? That's a bottom line that needs to be done thematically. Those metals need to be looked at more closely, and how do we actually support production, whether primary or secondary, of those. Recently, and in fact Monday, the prices of some of the key minerals and metals have been super volatile. So, for example, lithium today, about a year ago, I don't know exact figures, I think it was about 25 or sub 20 even dollars per kilogram of lithium. Today it's more than 70, okay? And that's because of this transition we are seeing. So, people who are in that value chain need to be able to hedge the price of some of these key metals as well. So there were four contracts that we launched on two metals. Number one was on cobalt, cobalt metal itself, which is the standard, and second on cobalt hydroxide. That's world first by an international exchange, and there's a reason why we did that as well. The second one, lithium, there is lithium hydroxide and lithium carbonate. And again, that was first by an international exchange, if you'd like. As of today, or rather as of yesterday, there were 25 lots already traded on these contracts, which is actually quite nice to see. And so tools to provide hedging and the ability to actually support the ongoing usage of these critical metals is really, really needed.
So Herry, I hear what you're saying in the sense of there are ESG approaches that are meant to be used in certain ways, and that they are, I hear you saying, roughly fit for purpose, but there have been studies done by both McKinsey and PwC that somehow suggest things are not working as well as they should be, because PwC found last year that mining companies with a higher ESG rating have an average total shareholder return that is 10% higher than the general market index, which means that if you're good, you're treated well by the market. But ergo, if you're not good, you're punished, right? McKinsey has said that the cost of capital for a mining company can be actually 25% higher if it has the lowest ESG scores compared to others in the market. So whatever the rights and the wrongs of that, we are making it practically more expensive for mining companies to operate in a way that enables us to get access to all of that very limited supply of mining metals that we need to get our hands on. So how do we make sure that the right approach, right ESG approach, is applied in the right way to get us to the right result?
Yeah. So traditionally, some of the ESG rating methodologies had quite a heavy focus on policies and governance. So beyond the G bucket, even in E and S, much of the scores were about, do you have a policy in place for water? And if you're in an industry where you do not have water stress and therefore you do not need to have water policy, if you don't have a water policy, then you get 0 points, right? So there is, and also some of these methodologies sometimes a little bit more black box. So there is a movement today. Also, in particular, in the financier space, where there is a little bit of a move away from solely relying on third-party rated ESG rating information. But because data, depending on where you are and the sector you're in, could be quite scarce, they will still source that data, but they wouldn't use that as the only internal rating system. So they would combine that with engagement strategy. That's the 6th strategy that I forgot to mention. You know, there's stewardship, investors engage with other companies to get information directly from the management. So they would take that data and increasingly form their own perspective, taking into account the key, thematic drives that they have. And today, as we all know, climate and net zero and energy transition, these are the key themes that's driving the focus of investors. So that's a key trend that we're seeing. And so, yes, I do think we need to make the black box of that methodology clearer, and some of the focus performance metrics, as I said, or impact metrics would have to be isolated and clearly seen, and those are what needs to be utilized together with some of the other data.
Thanks, Herry. Anthony, so I came across the paper that the World Economic Forum did in, I think, January of this year. And it was titled, How to Deliver on Climate Pledges, Look at These Industries Transitioning to Net Zero. And I think it was building on a lot of the work that the Mission Possible Partnership was leading on. And what I found quite fascinating about it is that you are looking at a granular way at each industry and working out what that individual industry sector needs to do in order to achieve and stay within the 1.5 degree target by 2030. And it's quite informative in the sense that you're very specific. You need 70 near-zero steel plants that can produce 280 metric tons of annual primary steel, 900,000 zero-emission trucks on European roads, dare I say the rest of the world, with at least 290,000 charging points and 2,500 refueling stations across the continent. For aviation, which is a very hard-to-abate sector, you say we need 300 sustainable aviation SAF plants, fuel plants, built around the world, with around 50 of them in the EU alone. And they have to be able to produce 30 million tons of SAF just to achieve a 10% share of SAF globally, right? That's 10% globally. That's the minimum required in order to get to the SAF number. Now, again, add this to the staggering demand for metals and minerals that Dave was talking about. Do you hear all of this in the context of Plan A, and do you still feel optimistic, or how do you see it?
It depends which day I wake up, whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I definitely have optimistic days, but I have pessimistic days. I mean, I think I'm really pleased that David set the scene so well, because, I mean, this is the decade where we've got to get granular. We've got to actually look at, well, what does this mean? What does net zero mean? It's great that we're getting all of these companies. I think something like 3,000 now have taken on a SBTI, science-based target. It's great that we have, and I'm sure someone here will know how many countries now have incorporated a net zero by 2050 commitment into law. I mean, all of that is fantastic, although, of course, the High Court this last few weeks in the UK just told the government their plan to deliver on that legal commitment was nowhere near good enough. And surprise, surprise, lacked the granularity and detail, and have told them to go back and try again. I mean, that's the reality we are in. And this is why we spent the last 2 years working on these high ambition, industry-backed roadmaps to net zero for 7 sectors, and using those to develop these sector transition strategies. And another paper, that was part of that series that you quoted was called, Industry Decarbonisation is a Team Sport. the reality is, and as you probably gathered from Peter's introduction, I was a lawyer for many years. I've done my fair share of M&A, project finance, complex structured transactions, advising companies. And there is no way on earth, or no one finds this joke funny as we move Davos to May, but there's no way, as a snowball's chance in a May Davos, that we get there with the normal deal-making process. I mean, we are going to have to look at a level of public-private collaboration to get us there that is probably has been out of favour with the sort of liberal based approach that we've had to markets over the last few decades, and probably is unprecedented. But we simply will not get there. When it is taken, as we heard in Davos during an industry decarbonisation meeting from one of the biggest offshore wind developers, that it just took them 8 years to get approval for one of the biggest offshore wind farms off the coast of one of the Nordic countries. When we've heard from one of the world's biggest steel companies that the green, and I won't give the numbers, but the quite substantial number of green steel plants they actually want to invest in and build, with 6 governments who will support them, they've got to now put that on hold for 3 years for a state aid approval process. You realise that the normal deal making approach is not going to get us there. We have to, in a sense, do for deal making what Ford did for manufacturing. We have to find a way of industrializing and creating a pipeline of projects and infrastructure, that is fast tracked. And in a sense, I mean, that seems, like I am being completely unrealistic. But there are examples of where approaches like this, have accelerated progress. And I'll just give you 3 examples. About 10 or 15 years ago, the Gates Foundation and the UN Foundation created something called a switching station, and they used the convening power of the UN Foundation and Bill Gates himself to bring the CEOs, the heads of regulatory authorities, ministers together to first accelerate the development of polio vaccines, and not to the unprecedented scale we just saw with COVID, but then accelerated dramatically, and then bringing the heads of, in some cases, the heads of state, heads of the Ministry for Health, the health authorities, to accelerate the health programs to roll that out. And and we know with dramatic impacts on polio. In the UK, we saw the Green Investment Bank working with the Carbon Trust, in a sense, was able to do a very similar thing to unlock offshore wind in the UK. Similarly, bringing all the key parties and decision makers together to accelerate the process. And we just saw that we were able to develop vaccines in 10 months that if you had talked to anyone from that industry before COVID, they would have told you to do that would have taken 10 to 20 years. So clearly, when we have a crisis mindset, we can accelerate. But we don't have the crisis mindset, and here we are talking about something at an unprecedented level across every sector of the economy, which is why we need to get realistic about what those net zero commitments mean in practice. Because you've got 3,000 companies, and apart from about 1 or 2 of those, they are all at one end of the value chain. They are all at the consumer-facing end. They've made commitments for their Scope 3, yet none, apart from Holcim last week that did finally take an SBTi target, none of the companies, whose Scope 1 and 2 are their Scope 3 have taken those commitments. So, I mean, how does that square up? So with the funding from Bezos, Earth Fund, Bloomberg Philanthropy, Breakthrough Energy, which is Bill Gates, and some other philanthropists, and a lot of pro bono support from Systemic and McKinsey, we have worked with over 400 companies to develop these bottom-up granular roadmaps, and the numbers you were quoting. And some of those have been updated, and I just encourage you to go to the Mission Possible website and have a look, because this sets out where we need to get by 2030. But I think it also makes it real that, we have got to find a new process for getting there. And we have got to accelerate the process, the speed at which we do deals and transactions. So there are a couple of areas where we are working on that on the ground. So we have just been fortunate to get another grant from the Bezos Earth Fund for $24 million to focus on 2 industry clusters, Houston and LA, to look at how can we accelerate the deal-making process there, and then take those learnings and insights and effectively socialize those around the world. The forum has launched its Net Zero Industry Clusters initiative with 10 industry clusters. We hope to grow that to 100 by 2023. And in a sense, what we are seeing is this process, the industrialization, industrialized decarbonization and the scaling up of industrial energy, clean energy to support that is likely to happen in these clusters and then be joined through green corridors. That's how it will play out. The question is, can we hit those milestones by 2030? And those 2030 numbers you quote, you don't want to see the 2035, 2040, 2045 numbers. Those 2030 numbers are just the jumping off point to get the green premium down sufficiently to scale. Now, it's very sobering, and it is a huge lift. But I do believe that we could do it. The question is, will we? And it comes down to will. We have the technologies, we could scale. I'm a little bit more optimistic about our ability to find new resources and commodities. I was just thinking about, if we went back 100 years and how many countries were producing oil, 100, we're probably, if you think the first light bulbs were being rolled out in 1880, we're, in terms of decarbonisation, net zero, clean energy, we're probably at the equivalent of sort of the 1930s for building that energy system. We're 50 years in probably to the realistic development of clean energy, but clearly, we have got to accelerate that process, and that comes down, I think, to political will. I think the good news is that doesn't need to happen everywhere. We can do that in certain countries where you can develop that political will. So it is possible. The question is, will we? Why am I pessimistic about our ability? Sorry, why am I optimistic about our ability to grow? Because if you go back, and we did this at Carbon Tracker. I was on a couple of panels with Daniel over the years, and we went head to head with some of their analysis actually and the IEA analysis, and sometimes didn't make ourselves best friends, but it all worked out in the end. We went and actually we went back and we looked at all the analysis from the energy industry, including some that Daniel was involved in, on the growth of wind, solar, even batteries and electric vehicles, and not just underestimated, but they dramatically underestimated year after year after year after year. And the adjustments, they didn't seem to learn from the lessons. We did a big analysis on what were the implicit effectively errors and assumptions in that. And it was very much the fact that there just was a built-in pessimism to predicting the future and human ingenuity and our ability to transform at speed. And if you look at the curves of those predictions for growth against what actually happened, it is dramatic. I think the report was called Lost in Transition. It is well worth going back and having a look, because we unpick that and the inbuilt biases in many of the models to predict the future. And it is playing out, the same thing is playing out with batteries and electric vehicles. And actually it happened in reverse, because, the first chairman of Carbon Tracker, Jeremy Leggett, founder of Solar Century and some other companies, he was also very much part of a community that was predicting the fact that we were going to run out of oil and gas. We didn't. We found more. But the question is, I think, do we have the will? Will we bring enough people together? Can we unlock the decision making? And maybe just finish on one topic that is really rising very quickly to the top. It was a big, we started to hear a lot about this in Davos. We heard a lot. I don't think every session I went into that was dealing with the energy transition or industry, this topic came up again and again. The speed of permitting and regulation, whether it's at the bottom, at the ground level, or in terms of antitrust and competition law. That is a global issue. Obviously, the solution is local. But in every country around the world, that is the biggest problem. Conversations we've been having with the US Department of Energy and the White House around, this issue, the clusters, the rollout of energy transition. Now with a huge stimulus of $500 billion, the biggest issue they are worried about is the speed of permitting. And we will not get there unless that is tackled and we find a solution for that. And I think one of the interesting issues here is now pitted the environment movement almost against itself, because even within the same organizations like TNC, you have the conservation side and you have the climate change side. And I think the argument goes something like this. The environment movement's become very good at developing its muscle to stop bad stuff. That's great. But what it is not very good at, and what it has to develop, is its muscle to speed up and accelerate the good stuff. And in a sense, one of the challenges, I think, to the movement is you cannot continue to throw brickbats at business and government around the speed at which they're developing this unless you play your part as well.
I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we stick to at least the title of our subject today, which is carbon pricing and ESG tools and whether or not they can help with energy transition. I'm going to ask David for your thoughts on this, because I see you at the crossover of both subjects. Do you believe that the way in which today we are leaning on voluntary markets, because we don't have an Article 6 market, will get us to where we want to get to in terms of incentivizing carbon abatement and therefore decarbonization? Do you believe that we've got that tool available, and is it working?
I think it's developing. So with all of these things, I think there's a different mindset that comes from being in markets, which is you try and then you iterate and you improve. So I can't say, like, if you look at the voluntary carbon markets, would they exist if policymakers could come together on a global basis? We know how to deal with externalities like carbon emissions. It was done to combat acid rain in the 1980s. With the NOx and SOx emissions, like, you put a cap on emissions and then you let people trade and you set a carbon price, and that carbon price disincentivizes polluters and incentivizes those who can bring new technology to the plate or invest in new capacity to not emit those types of emissions. So from an economic basis, we know how to do that. But then, of course, the crux of the issue is who sets the cap and who gets to allocate the emissions we have left in the global carbon budget. So we don't need anything else if policymakers could say, here's the global cap, here's every country's piece, you enforce it, go trade. Doesn't have to be complicated. So the reason I think the voluntary carbon markets exist is because the government markets couldn't come to that answer. And so stakeholders said, we can't wait for government, so we're going to go to corporations and make them promise to put a cap. And some of that's been enforced through ESG type investing. Others, people within those companies saying, this is a big problem, I don't want to be contributing to it, and so I'll set the cap. Now, those caps are interesting, right? Because on the one hand, they're voluntary. And so, when push comes to shove, are they really going to hold? Or will people say, look, we just got to do business? Or, even though I think over 700 of the biggest companies have made these pledges, if you don't get certain countries to stop emitting, it doesn't really matter. I mean, most of the emissions are still coming out of China, out of India. They're building coal-fired power plants. Is Europe going to sacrifice its industry? Is the US going to sacrifice its industry? Are people going to make these trillion-dollar investments if the neighbor next door keeps polluting? So I think that's where the difficulty lies. I think it's a great first step. And I think that's the key. To me, if you get the carbon price in the market, and whether you do it through the voluntary markets and it's, the cap is being created by companies and stakeholders, that's a good start. And maybe that gets us a little farther down the road, gets people used to using carbon pricing, gets people used to differentiating, starts incentivizing some of these industries so that they can scale up, starts disincentivizing some of the others. Then that gets us on the way. And maybe it helps with some of the other issues of, seeing who are allies instead of antagonists. Because when you look around, I think one issue that's come up with the ESG is there a vilification of the energy sector? Is there a vilification of the mining sector? And I think there is. And we need the investment. And I don't know how you do anything of this scale. Those are the only companies that know how to operate at that scale globally. So if they're not on side, I don't see how you get it done.
Herry, the way Anthony and I lived through Carbon Markets 1.0, the carbon price that Dave was referring to was essentially Scope 1 emissions, right? And we know sustainability commitments have led to net zero claim commitments, and essentially the pathway for decarbonizing individual companies, many of whom are listed companies on an organization like SGX, involves actually for the first time putting a price not just on their Scope 1 emissions, but potentially the Scope 3 emissions. Now, it's those Scope 3 emissions that they can't control. It's in their supply chain. It's in other countries. And in one sense, voluntary markets are a proxy, partially, for the cost of any responsibility they want to take for that. If I think about what Dave's saying about carbon pricing, and I think, therefore, about the sustainable commitments or the net zero commitments that have arisen as a result of the ESG push, do you believe that focusing on a Scope 3 pricing mechanism, which is kind of what the voluntary markets are a proxy for, is in fact the best way to decarbonize?
Well, frankly speaking, I think we don't have much choice but to fire all cylinders we have today in order to find ultimately funding to go towards the projects, right? That's what carbon credits do. They put the funding towards the projects that critically need the funding to make that, whatever the type of credit it is, right? Whether it's removal or, just more reduction focus, etc. That's where the money needs to go. So let's not confuse what's needed versus targets by companies, etc. The number one question that we keep on getting asked over and over and over again by listed companies, other companies in our ecosystem who know, and I'm talking about real economy companies here, who know that they have to go on that trajectory, but the moment they start to look at the costs of implementing that, it just doesn't add up. And so the number one question we keep on getting asked, of course, we are one of the partners that helped launch Climate Impact X, is how do you actually issue these things? How do we actually, is my project eligible? Can I get these issued? And so can I actually put that as a revenue stream that will help fund my project and get it up and running? It's not easy. These typically a lot of these projects have very long gestation periods. They're risky, etc. So they're looking for solutions to help fund these. So climate financing needs to happen, and carbon credits, by way of offsets, is likely and should be part of the mitigation toolkit. However, is that the only way? No. The mitigation hierarchy does say you do have to try to do all you can to reduce what you can, right, in your value chain, including Scope 3. And Scope 3 probably requires a bit more ingenuity, and some of that we see happening already. So, like RE100 committed companies, particularly the tech sector companies, they've been doing for years already, sort of working together with supply chain companies in China, for example, to say, why don't we collectively put some money into the pot and actually, invest in renewable energy, solar, for example, and so that we actually can inset as well, right? So some of that's happening. But a lot of these solutions, today, the carbon pricing is not uniform for one. There's a lot of preference to, offset where your footprint is as well. So, if I don't know, Rio Tinto has carbon emissions in China, then they would actually want to try to offset there, right, before they go on to elsewhere as well. So the carbon pricing, I don't think is going to be uniform for some time. The commitments are happening, and so companies are looking for these solutions. Now, one more thing I want to add is this sense of common, suddenly forgot the name, the common goals, but differentiated responsibilities. Common and differentiated responsibility it applies by regulation at the country levels. It does not apply today at the private sector level. So there is a disconnect there. And that's where we continuously need to solve for, what does it mean asking for a financial institution or company that's serving the economy in a country that has a 2070 target, right, to go for 2050 target? So these are some of the components that we have to solve for, and I think a well-regulated carbon pricing will have a role to play there.
Anthony, Dave's touched on the challenge of a carbon budget being carved out, and deployed. We know the Paris Agreement doesn't do that yet, and I don't see it ever getting to the point of doing it. Do you think the private sector can do it?
I mean, before I get to that, I want to respond to David's point about, because I think the points you made are well made, but it gets to political will, society's will, and whether we really perceive the existential crisis. Is there anyone from the retail sector, retail investing in the audience? Anyone in that space? It's a shame, because there's I read this article a couple of weeks ago that one of the biggest growth areas in that space is bunkers for ultra high net worths. And you can either buy now yourself a sort of little apartment in an underground complex with all the necessary protections and resources, or you can buy your own. You can even get an underground swimming pool. There's a nice little picture of the deck chairs around this swimming pool built within this bunker. And the one thing that was really interesting in the article is one billionaire has even entered into a retainer with a Navy SEALs team that when things do really break down, they will come straight there and protect him. What I don't think any of them have thought about is how do they pay these people with the guns when money has no more meaning. But anyway, that's a whole nother issue to think about. There was also a piece, and I follow quite a lot of the climate scientists in the space, and there was a really interesting piece Catherine Hayhoe posted on LinkedIn, and a comment to an article on that HSBC head of sustainability who was sacked for saying, well, who cares? Most of my exposure's over 7 years. And so why do I care if New York's underwater? And anyway, won't we build walls or something? And her comment was that for a lot of people, they haven't emotionally accepted this is not about another crisis. This is a collapse. A lot of people in the financial sector, they go, oh, crisis, great, I can trade through that. There's always the other side. You always make money, on the other side, as a lot of people are trading in, sterling at the moment are sort of working out. But there isn't another side to a collapse. I mean, what do you trade on the other side of a collapse? I guess you take your money and you hide in a bunker and you hope it's worth something. So the political will is really important. So do I believe that we can set the cap? Well, I don't necessarily think it's governments, because you're right. Kyoto, we had that top-down mechanism, great, but that was quite arbitrary anyway in terms of the amount of those assigned amount units and the whole mechanism. It's science, it's the planet that sets the cap, and it's called a carbon budget. And there's a lot of numbers now and analysis around that carbon budget and what's, how much is left. The work we have just done in terms of these pathways sector by sector, if that is done for all sectors, you can see the emissions under each pathway to net zero for each sector and where they should be in terms of those emissions. And if one sector's behind, one sector's advanced, you suddenly have carbon that you can trade between sectors. It becomes quite a powerful tool to accelerate those sectors where it's cheaper and technologically easier, and where those sectors that are struggling can buy a bit more capacity to give them that time. And that mechanism would work really well. And it's actually critical to make that link, because the Achilles heel for this market, it's great that we've got carbon markets 2.0, it's great the voluntary carbon market is growing, but until you make the robust connection between the allocation of carbon and net zero and the pathway there, it is always quite rightly going to be open to criticism that, oh, well, that's just, you're buying your way out of this, you're not investing in reductions. So for any company, it's critical, and this is the message we have, and actually many of our members are doing this. They have a very robust commitment to net zero, and their use of carbon markets is part of that. It's not independent. They're not just going, we're going to go carbon neutral. No, we have a commitment to net zero. We're investing in that, and carbon markets and investing in offsets is part of that strategy. So I do think you can make the link. Most financial markets in the world didn't grow up because governments created a rule or a framework. Money itself was created by the markets, and governments came in to regulate it afterwards. We can do the same with carbon markets. The carbon market itself, the private sector, could do this analysis, and it is a number crunching exercise, but with these pathways and roadmaps, it could do this, and it could effectively set that allocation, because governments are not. Can you imagine those intergovernmental conversations between 190 governments trying to say how much each government has a right to from the carbon budget? That's not going to happen. So we need to do it, but the private sector should step in and do that analysis.
And I think we need to try and work on antitrust laws in order to make sure that those don't become an impediment.
Well, yeah, just on that point, there's a good reason that most governments created monopolies when they were trying to build railways or electrify New York or whatever in the beginning, because monopolies are a good way to actually get something off the ground and started. Competition law is critical once you get to a steady state, but when you're trying to dramatically change something very quickly and you're asking businesses and companies to invest a huge amounts in infrastructure to do that and get there really quickly without government spending money, then, you know, it's probably quite legitimate if you've got an overarching objective to do that outside of antitrust and competition law. And actually, antitrust and competition law is going to stop us getting to net zero, you know, creating far more problems than it was designed to solve.
So I think that's the theme of our next event. I'm very conscious of time, but I have such a good panel here. They've done all the hard work for me. I do want to ask you, the audience members, if you have any questions for anyone in the panel. We do have a roving mic, I believe. Who's got the mic? Okay, we've got mics around. If you would like to ask a question, please put your hand up. We'll get the mic to you, and by all means, introduce yourself and maybe perhaps say which one of our panelists do you think is best placed to answer your question. Mike's coming to you.
Hi, Vidonaya from Hartree Partners. My question is more on the net zero pledges. 2025 is going to be the first round where the pledges are going to come into force, where the early adopters have said they're going to try and reach towards net zero. But as we've seen recently with the war, a number of folks have already pulled away from their offset programs, and also governments already lighting their coal power plants. The question is, as 2025 comes, a number of these companies have also not fully got to grips with how they're going to reach their net zero targets. Like a New Year's resolution, what's your confidence that the number of these pledges will actually come through and these corporations will follow through with it, given that it's purely voluntary, these are created?
So this is really a question about, do voluntary pledges ultimately get followed through on when push comes to shove? So, Herry, do you want to have a go at this one?
Did you want me to answer that?
Happy to. It's open to everyone.
Yeah. So you know, to be honest, even the net zero pledge world is a little bit of a wild, wild west today. There's, you know, so many different ways to get there. But the most authoritative that has been institutionalized by linkages to the official sector is the Race to Zero, that links to the COP processes as well. So that's the campaign for climate change mitigation by the private sector across the different sectors. And then there's the Race to Resilience, which is more for adaptation. Needless to say, there's been a lot more action on the Race to Zero front. Now, first of all, it does not help. Once companies have done the analysis and signed up to a Race to Zero sort of aligned net zero pledge, which has public sector appointed, i.e. UN-related appointed personnel who are running these campaigns, if the standards criteria suddenly change overnight, and everyone's sort of just expected to follow it, that does not help. And so that we need to have a bit more of a governance around how the net zero voluntary pledges are actually run. Otherwise, companies will get spooked by that as well. So if the goalpost changes by certain of these standards as well, can you reach it? I don't know. So to have a goalpost that does not move, it will move over time, of course, right? We know that. But at least when companies have planned and spent months or years trying to come up with a plan and the goalpost moves, of course you're not going to meet it. So that's one point. Now, in the current world, you know, we all know we are living in a very complex world. You know, the geopolitical picture is more complex and unprecedented than ever. It's not just the companies, even some of the countries had to reverse in some of the actions that they're taking. If I were to look at some of the silver lining there, if there were to be increases in some of the, or rather delay in closure of some of the coal-fired power plants, it is clear that those would be on the abated basis, right? i.e. there would be some kind of capturing or storage. of the existing plants, not new ones, right? And in terms of renewable energy ramp up, that's also become more significant. So would that mean there are also more opportunities for companies as well? I hope so. But there is, I do hope that the goalposts and how we set the goalposts does get more standardized and it becomes a more open process.
Any more questions?
Could I just, answer that as well? Because I think I've also been surprised about many of these pledges without the underlying, roadmaps and benchmarks to get there. And I think that's again why the sort of roadmap work that we've done is so important, and is bottom up, because you can then see where are different sectors, and those sectors then can start to develop their own methodologies and plans. So we're getting a lot of requests now from many of the companies that are part of the World Economic Forum. Can we work on a common methodology for them to develop roadmaps to net zero at a company level? Now we've done it at a sector level. We know that the leadership group for industry transition, led by India and Sweden, that now has about 25 governments, is looking at how you incorporate these sort of sectoral roadmaps into the NDCs, so effectively industrial policy. So again, all of those will allow you to see where companies should be. And without those benchmarks, it's also quite difficult. I was struck by the controversy in the last few weeks, that's been in the newspapers about the oil and gas companies, PR, if you like, or that's the accusation. They're making a lot of green PR that, is not backed up by the reality. And the figure that is cited is they're only spending 10% of their capital expenditure on clean energy and renewables. Now, if you had the sort of industry-backed, bottom-up roadmap that we've just done for the 7 harder-to-abate material sectors and mobility sectors for oil and gas, you'd be able to look and go, well, actually, that 10% right now is about right, or no, it's not. They should be spending 15 or 20%, and that should grow to this amount by 2025 and to this amount by 2030. So I think those sector roadmaps are critical to allow us to judge where companies are on those commitments. And the other point I would just make vis-a-vis Europe is that we're seeing the carbon price go up. A carbon price is one of the really great flexible mechanisms that would allow you to deal with the sort of shocks we're seeing at the moment. And the combination of that high European carbon price and now the wonderfully named IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act. It's very difficult for a British person to talk about the IRA. But anyway, sorry, just on an aside, in a session last week at our SDIM event in New York, one of the CEOs said, the thing I like about the IRA, and I was like, what? The thing you like about the Irish Republican Army? No. Is that now makes globally hydrogen cost competitive in this current energy crisis with gas, with fossil fuel-based generation, which is very different to where we were a year ago. So, there's pros and cons to what's going on.
So I'm going to end with a quote, and I've stolen this quote from Dave's podcast. It's the Robert Friedland podcast, I should say. And what he said is that we need a much more sober and grounded view of what it takes to actually transform the way we generate electrical energy, transmit electrical energy, and utilize electrical energy in a circular economy that is truly sustainable for your kids and grandkids, and it takes intelligent, rational discussion. That's what inspired me to do this event, and that's what inspired me to get these guys on the chair in front of you. I hope we've had some intelligent discussion. Thank you very much for coming, and may I please invite you to show your appreciation for my panel, please.